In this video, we're going to show you how to set up formulas to drive the calculations that price your products using Option Price Calculator. The first thing I want to show you is actually a help doc. And you can see it up here. This is the URL, strategicedgesystems.com/docs/option-set-calculations. If you come to strategicedgesystems.com and do a search for option set calculations, you will find this in the dropdown, and it'll take you to this page. I want to point out this page because a lot of the things we're going to talk about now are documented here, and this is a really good place for you to come if you're not sure how to do something, if you're looking for a formula or how to use a formula. This place will give you that documentation that you need to be able to do these things. Some of the things that we show you here are all of the different types of arguments that you can use. So addition, plus, subtraction, minus, multiplication, that's a star, division, this is the /, and then you have parentheses as well, where you can open and close parentheses. All of the calculations in the app are going to follow BEDMAS. Now, if we go back to grade 6 math and algebra, what BEDMAS is, and I encourage you to look that up, that's basically the order of operations. So when you write a formula, you do need to pay attention that you are using parentheses in the appropriate place so that you can control how the calculation is actually formatted and which parts of it gets calculated first. And an example of where this would go wrong is if you had a whole long string of values multiplying each other together, and then you all of a sudden decided to add a value in the middle of that, or divide something in the middle of that, or subtract something. That would cause a problem where most likely the output value doesn't match what you were going for, and that has to do with the order of operations. And without the brackets, you don't tell the calculator the order that the formula should be calculated in, and therefore you may not get the result you're expecting. We also have a slew of functions that you can use. So if you can't quite do something with the basic arguments that we have, there are also some things that you can do using functions. And so these are them documented here. You can see we have the ability to do rounding functions. You can calculate absolute values of numbers. That would take like a negative number and make it positive. Seal or ceiling, so that would round towards the larger number. Exponential, that allows you to do exponential calculations. Power allows you to do power calculations. The square root, and then square as well. There's lots of different types of calculations here. There is one that doesn't seem to be documented. There's also floor, which allows you to round towards the lower side of a number. Notice here we go. This is talking about BEDMAS, as I mentioned. So brackets, exponents, division, multiplication, addition, subtractions. When you use the brackets properly, BEDMAS will be followed. Now, we also have a whole bunch of different calculations that can be used depending on the type of option that we're working with. This table outlines the different types of things that you can actually do. It also gives an example of how you would reference that particular type of option in a formula. As an example, if you have a drop-down, a text, a paragraph, an email, or a file upload option, and if the unique identifier for that was, say, size, this would be all you have to do to reference this type of field. You would just use the unique identifier directly, and you would get the value you wanted. But there are other options that have other types of data you can get. So for example, a multi-select option. This would be like a swatch or radio button where someone could select multiple values. We have a way that you can get out the number of values that have been selected. So for example, you might want to know that someone has selected 2 or 3 values. All options are assigned a value either through a fixed constant or through a formula of some sort. What that means is things like a number option where a user inputs a value or a number, it doesn't mean the value that's output for it or the price that's output for it is the same as the user's input value. You would assign a number field. Maybe you say anytime a value is entered, it's worth 15. That means that the value that would come from this would be 15. Now, if a user entered in, say, 11, the value is still 15 that gets output, even though the user input 11. So it's important to understand that. I'll show you that in a little bit more detail next, but ultimately, you can use formulas like this, size.input value, where what would happen is, instead of the regular value that gets set for the formula or for the number field, the actual user's input could be used. And you do that using a formula. Dates, there is no value associated with those, same with instruction fields. Lookups. So a lookup is also named a measurement option. People had a hard time understanding what a lookup was, so we renamed this to a measurement option. And the idea is a user can enter 2 values, input 1 and input 2. That could be your length and your width, or whatever you want it to be. It's 2 separate values. We use those input values to look up a value from a table. There's a specific way of actually looking a value up, and that is with the formula down here. Now, before we talk about that formula, let's just finish this up one more time. So an input option has 2 inputs. Length and width. Now, it's not necessarily called length and width. You can name them whatever you want. But the point is it's 2 inputs. You can use, or you can get, the input value that the user has provided out of this option, and then you can use it in any of your formulas. So if you want to take the user's value that they've entered for input 1, you would do size.input1. That would give you the value the user has entered. Same goes for the input 2. This might be your length field. Whatever value somebody enters would become available for your formulas. Now, why that's important is now you can do things like area calculations. I could take the user's input for 1, and then I could take the input for 2, multiply them together, and now I know the area that a user has just entered. Now, in addition to getting things like the input values to calculate an area, a lookup option or a measurement option also has what we call a pricing table associated with it. The pricing table is a way where we basically do a VLOOKUP on the input values a user has provided to find a value that will now be used as the calculated value for a particular input. So for a lookup option, for example, or a measurement option, this would be the value that gets assigned to it when somebody enters in particular dimensions. The way it works is you have the name of the pricing table. So in this case, it's called size table. And one thing that's not showing here is all pricing tables actually end in an _PT. That stands for pricing table. So that's actually a mistake in the documentation. Be aware of that. So this would really be called size table _PT. Now, these brackets, they're square brackets. Inside of those, we would put the value that we want to look up from our pricing table. So the first value that's here, in this case, the 25, this represents input 1. The second value, in this case, is 55, represents input 2. A measurement option, or lookup option, will run this calculation automatically for you. So without doing any special formulas, we will automatically do this for you and output the value that comes from the pricing table that's associated with the lookup option or the measurement option. Now, what that means is when you do a VLOOKUP, you look across the top row, that's of the sheet, and you look for a value, so in this case 25, when you find the first value that's less than 25, that would be the column that we would choose along the first row. Then we're going to go down the first column looking for a value of 55. As soon as we find a value that's less than that, we would choose that particular row from the column. You match the two up, and that's the value that you output. We'll talk about more of that and visualize it later, but the key here is that's how this will work for you. We also have some built-in variables like product price, where we will pull the price that's associated with your product page. So this would be the price that's assigned to your product in Shopify admin. If you have variants on the page, this would be the variant price. So whatever variant is selected in the Shopify default options would be the price that gets passed to the product price variable. Product quantity is the quantity of products that have been added on the product page. Now this can either come from the Shopify quantity selector or from the option price calculator quantity selector. So typically you don't want to have both of these on the page at once. You need to only have one. So it will only choose the first one that it finds. Keep that in mind. If you're using the option price calculator quantity option, you should not have a Shopify quantity option. And then finally, we have up to 5 different pieces of metadata. This gets configured in the calculator block, and then you can use these values in any of your formulas to pull in the value of the metadata attached to a particular product. So those are all of the different types of variables that you can use inside of your formulas. Now, that might seem like a lot. We're going to go through a lot of those now in the process of actually building some formulas together. There's 2 different types of formulas that you can create. You can create a formula at the option level as well as at the calculator level. What that means is every single option in a calculator can use a formula to calculate what the value should be for that option. And at the very end, the calculator can also run its own calculation based on the values that were output for each of the options. That allows you to do some pretty sophisticated things because every option can calculate its own price, and then based on those prices, you can calculate a final price for the entire product. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the configuration at the option level, and then we'll take a look at it at the calculator level. So here I am. I will go to options, and you by no means have to do it here. You could go to calculators. I'm going to go here, and I'm just going to create a new option. And for this example, let's keep it simple. I will do a swatch option, and let's just go ahead and give it a name. We'll call it color. Now that we've named the option, it's important to highlight unique name. Unique name is an identifier that we use to reference all of the options inside of the app. This identifier will be unique for every single option that you create. We will define it automatically for you based on your display name, but if you already have an option that has that same name for a unique name, we will change that name slightly. If you want to keep your unique names easy to remember and less sort of ambiguous, then I recommend that if you do type in a display name that already exists, you'll see that this gets some numbers appended to it. What I would recommend you do as a little trick is change your display name slightly and then save the option. That will set the unique name to something that you'll more easily remember that is unique, and then you can come back and continue editing the option. In that way, you avoid having a unique name that has some strange number identifier at the end. So it's just a bit of a trick. Save it temporarily, then you can come back here and change the display name to whatever you'd like it to be so it makes sense. But just use this as a way to give the unique name the identifier that you wanted. Identifiers here are super important because you're going to reference each of the options in the system using this unique name. So let's just assume that we have a few colors here. I'll add a couple of them. And gold is expensive, so it's going to be worth a little bit more than red or blue. Now notice that this has the option of setting a value for each of these options. That means that if I leave that as value and I set this to 10, when somebody selects the option red, the value of 10 will be output for the value of this color option. Now for blue, if someone selects blue, we're going to output the value of 15. And for gold, it's a little bit more expensive. We need to do a custom calculation here. So instead of using a solid or a set value, we're going to use a formula. And what we will do here is we're going to use some of our calculation variables to create a formula for this. Now, a word of caution, because I'm working on an option that's not actually part of a calculator, we technically have access to all of the variables in the app. So this would be every single option that already has been created within the app. And so you can see there's a lot of them here. Now, you need to be aware that the scope of variables that are available to any option is only the variables that actually exist within the calculator that you're working on, that the option is part of. I'm making this option really devoid of the calculator because I'm just doing it separate. So I don't really have any set scope. I don't really know what variables I can use and which ones I can't use. You need to be aware of that when you're building formulas, that you only include variables that are actually part of the calculator that you're working in. If you add variables that aren't, it's not going to work. There is one exception. Lookup tables, if I scroll down to the bottom, here they are, lookup tables. Any lookup table that exists within the app is available to all calculators at all times. We can actually pull values from any pricing table inside of an option, regardless of if that pricing table is associated to a calculator. So these are always available. What's important to know is lookup tables or pricing tables is another way we refer to them. They can be associated to a lookup or a measurement option, but they don't have to be. They can also just be referenced in any of your formulas. And then finally, you can also see some of the other ones we talked about, like product price, product quantity, and then the metadata. Now, selecting any one of these variables, what you'll see happens is it inserts the system name for that variable right here into your calculator. This is where we're going to write a formula. It's very important that you actually write a real formula. As an example, this is not a formula. There is some arguments to be made that in math, if you put a variable beside another variable, or you put them in brackets, or you put a dot between them, that means automatically multiply. That does not apply here. In order for an argument to be used, you have to actually provide it. So if I wanted to multiply the product price by dimensions, I would need to actually put a value right here. In this case, the asterisk. The asterisk is what we use for multiplication. Not to be confused with an X, which is a letter, right? So an asterisk is how you multiply. If I want to divide, I'll use a forward slash. If I want to add something, I'll use a plus. and maybe I'm going to put 10. And then if I want to subtract something, I'll use a minus, and I will put 1. This is a formula. It's not a very good formula, and it is probably not going to calculate the way that I want it to. Because as I mentioned earlier, what we're doing here is we're multiplying, dividing, and adding all kind of at the same time. We probably want to add some brackets to help control how this works. We might want to actually do the multiplication here first, like so, and then divide by dimensions.input1, and then we're going to go ahead and add the plus 10 minus 1. Now, of course, this is kind of redundant. If you want to do that, you might do better just go plus 9. What I'm trying to show you here is not specifically a formula that matters. I'm just trying to show you how you can use this calculation field. The way that you find your calculation variables is just by selecting off of this and choosing the variable that you like. It's really that easy. Now, some of these we talked about, like dimensions.input1 and input2. This tells me that the dimensions option here is actually a measurement option or lookup option, so it therefore has 2 inputs. This option here, dimensions, would automatically return the lookup formula that I mentioned before. So it would return a value, and dimensions would be equal to a particular value. But if I wanted to use a particular input that a user gave, we could do input 1 or we could do input 2. Let me show you a couple tricks here. So if I do the dimensions, as I mentioned, this would return the value for the lookup option. And what the lookup option actually does is it looks up from a pricing table. And the way we would do this is the dimensions pricing table, which, by the way, dimensions is actually an option. It's a measurement option, and it's associated with a pricing table. The pricing table it's associated with is not necessarily named dimensions, all right? So just keep that in mind. It could be associated with any pricing table. Let's just take a look. There might be a pricing table called dimensions. It doesn't look like there is. But there are, if I scroll down here, these are the lookup tables that we have for the pricing tables. So I could technically use any one of these. And the dimensions measurement option is associated with one of these pricing tables. I don't know which one it is, but for this example, let's just go ahead and choose the size 2 pricing table, and let's walk through it. Now, remember I said dimensions is a measurement option and it has 2 inputs. So if I go into here, now I'm in the first element of the square bracket before this comma, and I put input 1. So that's the value a user enters into input 1. Now the second, after the comma, I'm going to put dimensions.input2. So this is the value that a user enters to the dimensions option into the input 2. This formula right here will return the same value that dimensions returns. Dimensions is the measurement option, and it will automatically perform a lookup operation for you into the pricing table that it's associated with. In this case, we're assuming it's associated with the size pricing table. This returns the exact same value as dimensions. So this is a swatch option, and this swatch option right now is a single select value. I could make it multi-select by checking this off, and once it's made multi-select, that means a user could actually select more than one value at a time. When they can select more than one value, that means that there are some additional calculation variables that become available. And let's see if we have one in here already. Selected count. So this is a different option. It's not the one we're working on because this is a brand new option. This is another option called shade style, and it has a selected count. This would return the number of selected options for a multi-select field. So if someone were to select red and blue, this would return the value of 2 for this option that we're building right now for color. So that's if you make this a multi-select. Now notice there is also a way to use a single value formula. What this means is maybe you don't actually want to calculate the price on a per option basis, and instead you want to calculate the price, the overall price for this option based on something else. So you can either set a value here as like 15 or 25. So that means no matter what is chosen for this particular option, it will output the value of 25. Now I should mention, if it's a multi-select and you're not using a single value, a user choosing more than one option here, if they chose this one and this one, this would actually output the value of 50, 25 plus 25. Each value gets added together automatically. Now, maybe you don't want to do that, like I said, and you're going to use a single value formula. This is where you can do some fancy things. So for example, I could use a formula, and now I could use the formula I looked at, color.input count. So this is going to say the number of values that are selected by the user for this particular input. So if a user chose 2 of them, this would output the value of 2. If they chose 3, that would say 3. Now this is really good if, for example, you have each, depending on the number of values people select, you want to calculate a price here. So maybe I'm going to multiply it by some value, the dollar amount that the options are worth. There's lots of things you can do here. You can use your imagination. Sometimes you want to do this because you want to apply maybe a specific discount based on the number of options that are selected. So like if I just did this times 3, for example, this would be no different than just setting the value for each of these to 1. Because they're all worth the same amount, it ends up being the same thing. But I could do something more sophisticated where, for example, I could use a lookup table to then take the number of selected options and output a price. I'll give you an example here. Maybe we have a lookup table. I'm going to make the name up, but say we have a lookup table called colors, or we'll call color selected. So that's the name of our lookup table. And we're going to put the color.input count at the beginning, comma, and then we'll just use, actually we're going to do slightly different. I recommend doing it this way. 1, comma, and then the number of inputs that are selected. Now, this is going to take a very specific format for your input table, but effectively what it will do is it will always look down the same column. So it'll look along the first row, pick the first column that has a value of 1, and then it's going to look down the first column, looking for the number of inputs that a user has entered, and then it will select the price. This allows you to do really fancy things where you could change the price depending on the number of inputs selected. So you could have a changing price that's not linear, non-linear price change. One final thing to mention is you can also write a formula for your discounts. You know, all the same things are available to you here, and you can write your own discount formula. Now let's go ahead and create a calculator from scratch, and then we will set up some calculations at the calculator level. What I'll do here is just assign a few random options, just because we want to be able to play with these. And let's do one more. I'll go to drop down. Let's assign it to a product so that we can see it. Here we go. Now we have a multi-select, we have a number input, and we have a drop-down field. Remember, each of these options have their own values associated with each of their inputs. Let's take a look at these quickly. I'll look at the number one first. Here's the number one. Notice this formula. What this formula is doing is it's outputting the user's input as the value for this number. It's really important to understand that. Let's look at the swash option. This one has various different numbers that are assigned to each of the different selections. Okay? And finally, let's look at the drop down. Same thing, just some static numbers assigned to each of those. Right. Let's just play around with this a couple times in a row here. Notice the price is set to 22, and the value that's entered in for front color is 22. Now, that particular option had a default value set. The initial number is 22. And because this formula is outputting the input value, that is why this has a value of 22. And notice if I change this to 10, the value changes to 10. The calculated price is also 10. It's important to understand, by default, a calculator is going to automatically sum all of the values for each of your options together. What does that mean? In this case, it would be front color plus shade color or shade style plus test dropdown 4906. That would be the formula that's automatically calculated without you doing anything. So that means if I were to select some more options here, like this one, notice it's adding up. 10 plus 5 is 15. Let's select one here. Plus 1 is 16. It's automatically summing all of my options together to calculate the value of 16. You don't have to use that, but that is done for your convenience, so you don't have to set up your own calculator. It works most of the time. If you want to do something more fancy, you might need a calculator level calculation, which we'll look at in a second. Now, I wanted to show you one more thing about this front color. Let's edit this, and I'm going to modify the formula. So instead of the input value, I'm just going to set this to have a value of 5. Watch the difference. Now notice the price is 5. It does not matter what number this is. The price is going to be 5, assuming I'm within the maximum range. So let's go to 50. There it is. It's 5. It doesn't matter what I enter here. So that's the thing you have to understand. Every option has a value that gets associated with it. A number option is no different than any other type of options. Just typically people get this confused and they think when you enter in a value that somehow that's what it should be worth. It's not. So if you want it to be worth that, you need to make sure that you're using this formula. When you create a number option, by default, it will set up this formula for you. So you don't really need to know it, but in case you get lost, there it is. Let's go ahead and look at the metadata. So there is variables, as I've mentioned, for metadata, and these pull from your product configuration and whatever your metadata fields are on your products. But the preview doesn't have the ability to pull your metadata values from your products. Therefore, what we do is we just predefine what those metadata values are. And they're listed right here at the bottom. We set metadata value for 1 to 2, metadata value 2 to 4, etc. Now, you might not want those, and for previewing, it's probably going to be confusing because you won't get the value you think you should. So you can modify these by clicking Set Preview Metadata, and now you can change this to whatever values you want them to be. Now this will calculate using these metadata field values I entered. Now, your calculator actually has to use metadata in order for it to make a difference. In this case, this is not, so these won't have any impact on our pricing. Let's scroll on down to the calculation section for a calculator. Very similar to the options, we have the ability to assign a discount, and you can either do it by an amount, a percentage, or a formula. Formula field here is going to work in the same way as the option ones, where we have a calculation variable where you can add any of your options. Now, one thing you should notice is the variables that are available here are scoped to the calculator. Unlike the option that we set up where we could actually choose any option from anywhere in the app, these ones are scoped to just the calculator, so options that are associated with the calculator. And keep in mind, I'm not saying that an option can use the value from any option in the app. When you set it up, it can, but you need to make sure it only uses options that are also in the calculator that it belongs to. That's the important thing to realize. I can choose any of these and I can make a formula for discount. This is going to calculate a value, so maybe front color times 0.10, that's 10% of the value entered for front color. Actually, 0.10. So this would give a discount that's 10% of whatever is entered for front color. What happens is we calculate the value here, taking the value for front color. So if I look up here, if front color was 22, 10% would be 2. Now that means the discount here that's returned would be $2. This $2 discount would be removed from the price that's calculated here. If I look up back here, we can see that now, and actually it's $2.20 is 10%. So you can see $2.20 is deducted from the price automatically for us. Really easy, as you can see. Now let's take a look at the calculation here. What I want to first show you is uncheck automatically add option values, and that's pertaining to what I mentioned where we automatically add the value of each of the options. Front color plus shade style plus test dropdown 4906. So when I have this unchecked, the calculator is going to assume there's a calculation here. We need to actually put a calculation here. So that's what we're going to do right now. Let's add what the default calculation is, which is front color plus shade style plus test dropdown 4906. This is the same as when this is checked. And just to check, does it look like it is? I would say so. Let's choose that. So it's a little hard with the discount, but yes, it looks correct. That is indeed the same formula that we use by default. Now, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to go ahead and do this because, well, you might as well have just not added this formula. Let's go ahead and add some more values to this. Let's subtract 10. Now, as I mentioned, you want to make sure it follows BEDMAS, so I'm going to go like this. I want to calculate the total price and then subtract 10 from it. Now, this is a bit weird because it's kind of like a discount, and I could technically do this by using the discount value up here. But what happens when I do it down here is it's part of the actual price. If I put something up here, it's going to show up as a discount. So this $10 is not going to be a discount. Let's take a look. So 22 plus 5 plus 1 is 18. Now remember, it's 18 because it's 22 plus 5 plus 1 is, and then minus 10. That's the thing, right? So that's 18. And then we're subtracting our 10% discount. So there's many, many different formulas that you can build here. One other option that's really important to know about is this calculation is total price, not unit price. Why this is important is oftentimes you want to calculate a total price, that is the price of your products, including the quantity that a user has selected. So if someone selects 100 quantity, you want to display the total price of all of that 100 quantity of units. The problem is Shopify does not work that way. Shopify operates on a per unit basis. What that means is every item added to cart has to be priced per unit. If you add 100 quantity of a product at $100 each, it will get added to cart 100 times 100. Every single unit will get the price of $100 rather than every single unit getting the price of $1. When you check this off, the calculator will automatically divide the total price that's calculated here by the quantity of units that are selected, and then therefore what gets added to cart is the unit price instead of the total price, which will make sure that the calculations match what actually gets added to cart. There's a number of other calculations you can do in a calculator that are a little bit more hidden and do some slightly different things that aren't necessarily directly about changing the price. The first one that I'm going to take a look at is found under SKU and inventory location. And if you go to the SKU, you'll see that you can actually set a SKU based on a formula. This is going to work very similar to the regular calculations, but there's a couple nuances. Notice that each of the variables that are inserted here are actually inside of these two squiggly brackets. So there's squiggly brackets on both sides of the calculation variable. That's the first big difference for this particular type of formula. The way it works otherwise is the same. You are going to select variables and you can put them in here. When you do insert one, it will insert it with the appropriate brackets. There's a big difference in terms of how this one functions versus how other calculations work. The other calculations ultimately are going to derive a single value, some number. What works differently here is we're not trying to derive a number. Instead, what we're going to do is derive a SKU, which is really a sequence of letters and numbers. So it could be a word or some combination of letters and numbers and words. What gets output here is dependent on the type of option that you select. Typically speaking, it's not going to be the value that an option has. Instead, it's going to be the selected option. So for example, if you have an option for color and somebody chooses the color blue, that blue color might have a value of 11, but the 11 is not returned here. Instead, what's returned is the color blue. That is the name of the selected option. So back color might actually return the value of blue. So just as an example, this might end up saying blue here. Now shade style, maybe this is like a percentage of coverage from a shade perspective, like how translucent it is or how transparent. So maybe the shade style would have a value of 90%. Then it has the back color is blue. The fabric schedule B input, that's like some dimension probably. So maybe it's going to say something like 59. And then the date might be the value of a date that gets input. What I'm trying to show you here is that the way that this is output is a lot different. It's not giving you a value. Instead, it's giving you a combination of selected options. So this helps you derive a SKU name based on selected variables. One thing to mention is most of the SKU calculations are going to append some values to the end of it because we need to make sure that they're always unique. The other thing that I should mention is there are some cases where you want to be able to specifically identify, is this a SKU that's coming from Option Price Calculator, or is this a SKU that we have defined in Shopify in some other way? For that reason, I highly encourage you to always start your SKUs, even if they're calculated, with something that identifies it as an Option Price Calculator product variant. Something like, we use this in many other places, OPC dash. Now, by doing this, you can also add your code to do things like filtering out variants from your variant selectors. You probably don't want to show the Option Price Calculator variants, and if you include this here, you can now identify each of your variants depending on if they're an Option Price Calculator one or not, and then filter it out. That's how you use SKU formulas. They're a little bit different, but they work in a very similar way. The next type of calculation we want to look at is under the product weight calculation. So this allows us to calculate a weight of our product so that when it's added to cart, they're going to take the product weight or the variant weight that was just added to cart, and they're going to use that in calculating what the price of shipping should be. If you're selling large quantities of product or large volumes of product, like a whole bunch of tile or a whole bunch of wood, you probably want to incorporate some type of weight measurement into your calculation. Otherwise, your shipping is always going to be out of whack. So we can use this particular formula as a way to calculate what the estimated weight should be of the product someone's about to add. It's going to output a value, much like the other formulas, based on whatever calculation we put here. Typically speaking, you're going to be looking for things like the product quantity, because you're going to want to multiply whatever we have here by the quantity. Now, you might know that the total weight of your product depends on the area of the product purchased. And you might know that it weighs X pounds per square foot. So I might do something like this. Quantity times dimensions dot input 1 times dimensions dot input 2. This, by the way, is the area of material purchased. And then we're going to multiply that by the weight per unit of the product or per unit area. So if this was in square feet, you're going to want to put the weight per square foot of product. So maybe it's 0.5, and we know that it's pounds. So you can choose the unit of measure here. And so now, for every unit area, we're going to multiply it by 0.5, and then we're going to multiply that by the number of quantity that's been added to the cart. So this means that now the variant that's added to the cart, instead of having a weight of 0 or very low like 1, it can have a very specific weight that actually defines the weight of material that you expect. This will make a big difference in calculating shipping correctly and save you a lot of money. That covers all of the different types of formulas that you can set up inside of the calculator. One final thing for us to look at is pricing tables. What I'm going to do is go into a pricing table outside of the calculator and take a look at it there. So I'll just jump over to pricing tables, and I'll pick a random pricing table. Here we go. So this is a pricing table that's already been configured. And what we see here is some values along the top row and then some values along the first column. Now, when I've mentioned a few times before, I've said there's two inputs for a measurement option, and input 1 might be something like the width, and input 2 might be something like the length. Now, when a user enters in some values, our lookup formula, which I'm just going to draw right here, would be something like this. All right, so this might be a lookup formula. Now, input 1 would be the value that somebody ties to width. Maybe they put in the value of, say, 8. And then length would be the value that somebody puts in for the input 2. Say they put in the value of 20. Now, what happens here with this particular formula is it will look up into the size pricing table, which is this pricing table. The input value for dimensions for input 1 is 8. We look up for 8 across the first row. 1 is less than 8, yes. 2 is less than 8, yes. 10 is greater than 8. So what gets chosen is column C. Then input 2 is 20, and that looks down the first column. 2 is less than 20, 4 is less than 20. 20 is equal to 20. We choose this row. So what we will do is we'll output a value of 10. That's column C and row 4. Now let's just do another one. One thing that's worth noting is it doesn't round up. It's going to choose whatever value is closest to, but less than, or equal to. From a maximum perspective, if you're over the top number here, this number will be chosen. So if this was instead of 20, if this was, say, 25, and sorry, I made a mistake there. So if this number up here was 25, and this was 20, what would happen is 20 would get selected, and it would go across that row. So that's kind of the main details to know about pricing table lookup formulas. I guess the final thing to mention is this doesn't have to be input 1 or input 2 like I've shown here. This could be a fixed value, for example, 1. And I've shown this, I mentioned this earlier when we were looking at options. And what you might have in this case is you might not have these columns. Let's just delete them. And instead, we have a single column right here, B. It just has a value 1. And notice it matches up with input 1 here of 1. Because these match, this column will always be chosen. In the example that we saw before, instead of dimensions.input 2 up here, what we would actually have was, it was called color.input count. Now what we do is we look down this first column, and then we'd look for color.input count. So if someone entered the value of 3, we would find this value here, and we return 1. If someone entered or selected 4, all the way up to 20 options for a multi-select value, we would select 4, and then we would get this value of 5. So what's important to know is you can add your own formulas inside of each of these parts. So it doesn't have to just be a fixed value or dimensions.input 1. It could be entirely different calculations. It could be that plus 2, or it could be that plus 2 in brackets divided by 3. There's a lot of different things that this could be, but the point is you can add your own calculations inside each of these elements, and the return value for this can be multiplied. So I can use the value that gets returned for this and still use it in a calculation that's larger. So that's a pretty good detailed overview of how pricing tables work in conjunction with formulas and various values and variables from each of your options.